Chicago had a way of making loneliness feel louder when it rained. The storm rolled over the city just after 9, swallowing the skyline beneath sheets of silver rain. Neon signs blurred into streaks of color. Wind rattled old windows. Thunder echoed between brick buildings like distant gunfire. Grace Sullivan locked the front door of her small veterinary clinic and rested her forehead against the cool glass. Another 14-hour day, 3 emergency surgeries. 1 abandoned Labrador. 2 unpaid bills. And exactly 1 stale blueberry muffin waiting in her apartment upstairs. She smiled to herself. It wasn't much of a life, but it was hers. The bell above the clinic door jingled softly as the wind forced it open an inch before slamming shut again. Grace Sahil. Not tonight. She grabbed her umbrella and stepped outside. Rain immediately soaked the cuffs of her jeans. The street was nearly empty, except for the distant glow of headlights and the occasional rumble of traffic. Then she heard it, a sound so faint she almost mistook it for the wind. A tiny cry, high-pitched, desperate. Meow. Grace froze. Another cry, longer this time. Her veterinarian instincts overpowered exhaustion instantly. She followed the sound across the deserted sidewalk toward a narrow alley between 2 old brick buildings. Rainwater rushed through the gutter. Garbage cans had tipped over. Broken glass sparkled beneath flashes of lightning. Hello. Nothing. Then, meow. She lifted her phone flashlight. A pair of frightened golden eyes reflected back at her. A black cat. Tiny. Completely drenched. Its front leg was twisted awkwardly beneath its body. Oh, sweetheart. Grace crouched slowly. The cat hissed weakly but didn't try to run. You've had a rough night, haven't you? She removed her oversized cardigan despite the freezing rain. Carefully, very carefully, she wrapped the trembling animal inside the warm fabric. Only then did she notice it. Ağaçlar. Not leather, not nylon. Solid black, custom-made, no name, no phone number. Only one small silver crest engraved into the metal. A Wolf. She frowned. Well, someone loves expensive accessories. The cat rested its head against her arm as though surrendering. Its heartbeat slowed. Grace smiled. You're safe now. The clinic lights flickered back on. Warmth replaced the freezing rain. Grace placed the cat gently on the examination table. No broken spine. She carefully examined each paw. One fractured leg. Bruising along the ribs. Minor dehydration. Several small cuts. Whoever this cat belonged to, someone had been looking for him. She scanned for a microchip. Nothing. Strange. A cat wearing what looked like a $1,000 collar. Without identification? Her assistant, Megan, poked her head into the room. I thought you were going home. Grace smiled. I was. Megan looked down. Oh my God. Poor baby. The cat lifted his head slightly, but never took his eyes off Grace. What are you calling him? Megan asked. Grace laughed softly. I wasn't planning to. The cat blinked slowly. But, she scratched beneath his chin. He looks like an onyx. The cat purred. Megan laughed. I think he approves. Nearly midnight. The rain hadn't stopped. Grace carried Onyx upstairs to her tiny apartment above the clinic. The place was modest. Second-hand furniture. Books stacked everywhere. Plants growing on every windowsill. Photographs of rescued animals covered one wall. No expensive decorations. No luxury. Only warmth. She laid fresh blankets inside an old wicker basket beside the couch. There, Onyx refused to stay inside it. Instead, he limped across the apartment, jumped onto the sofa, then slowly climbed into Grace's lap. She looked down in surprise. Oh, you're one of those. The cat curled into a perfect black circle against her stomach. Within seconds, he was asleep. Grace gently stroked behind his ears. You really trust people too easily. She had no idea how ironic those words were. Across the city, 28 black SUVs raced through the rain. No sirens. No flashing lights. Only silence. Inside the lead vehicle, Luca DeLuca stared through the windshield without blinking. 40 years old. perfectly tailored black suit, no tie, dark eyes, calm enough to terrify everyone around him. His right hand rested on the leather seat. His left clenched a silver cat toy. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Marco Romano, his oldest advisor, finally broke the silence. We've searched every district. Nothing. Luca didn't answer. Security footage ends near West Lincoln Avenue. Still silence. Another minute passed. Then Luca spoke. One sentence, quiet enough to force everyone else to lean closer. He's frightened. Marco swallowed. Yes, boss. He hates thunderstorms. No one in the vehicle had ever heard Luca speak that softly, especially about a cat. One bodyguard looked away. Another lowered his eyes. The entire underworld believed Luca DeLuca feared nothing. Not bullets. Not betrayal. Not death. Yet tonight, he looked like a man losing the only family he had left. Earlier that evening, 3 men wearing delivery uniforms had infiltrated DeLuca Manor. Their mission hadn't been murder. It had been distraction. While security responded to a fake explosion near the garage, someone opened the conservatory doors. Onyx disappeared into the storm. The operation lasted less than 90 seconds. By the time Luca returned, the mansion was silent, the food bowl untouched, the scratching post empty. His study door hung open. Only muddy paw prints remained. The first body hit the marble floor 2 minutes later. No one knew which guard had failed. No one asked. Back in her apartment, Grace woke sometime after 3 in the morning. The television had turned itself off. Rain still tapped against the windows. She looked down. Onyx remained asleep beside her. For a brief moment, everything felt peaceful. Then, the cat's ears twitched. His entire body stiffened. He stared toward the window. A low growl vibrated deep inside his chest. Grace frowned. What is it? She pulled the curtain aside. Nothing. Only darkness. She almost closed it again. Then she noticed them. Far down the street, 2 black SUVs. Parked. Engines running. Their headlights off. Watching. A cold chill ran down her spine. She told herself they probably belonged to the police. Or private security. Or someone visiting a neighbor. Still, she locked every window before returning to bed. Onyx never took his eyes off the street. Neither did the men inside the SUVs. At exactly 6:42 the next morning, Grace was pouring coffee when the first engine echoed outside. Then another, then another, then another. She walked to the window. Her coffee mug slipped from her fingers and shattered across the floor. 1 SUV. 5, 10, 15, 20. Black armored vehicles filled the entire street. Men in tailored black suits stepped out in perfect silence. Each wore an earpiece. None looked like police. Every passerby stopped walking. Neighbors peeked through curtains. The bakery owner across the street slowly locked his door. Grace's pulse hammered. What? The men formed 2 perfectly straight lines leading to her front porch. No one moved. No one spoke. Then the rear door of the final SUV opened. A tall man stepped out. Black suit. Rain falling around him. Face calm. Expression unreadable. The entire street seemed to stop breathing. He climbed the steps toward her clinic with measured, unhurried steps. Grace instinctively reached for Onyx. The cat did something unexpected. He purred. The stranger stopped exactly 1 foot from the door. For several long seconds, he simply looked through the glass. Not at Grace. Not at the clinic. Only at the black cat sleeping peacefully in her arms. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, controlled, almost gentle. Did he sleep well? Grace couldn't answer. Not because she didn't know what to say. Because every instinct in her body screamed that the man standing outside her clinic wasn't simply wealthy. He was dangerous. The kind of dangerous that never needed to raise his voice. The kind that made 20 armed men stand perfectly still without being told. The rain continued to fall between them. Neither of them moved. Only Onyx did. The black cat lifted his head from Grace's arms. His golden eyes widened. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he jumped from Grace's embrace. Not to run. not to hide, straight toward the stranger. The suited bodyguards tensed instantly. Hands brushed concealed weapons. One man instinctively stepped forward. Luca DeLuca lifted a single finger. The bodyguard froze. Silence returned. Onyx limped across the wet wooden porch as fast as his injured leg allowed. Grace expected him to collapse. Instead, the cat rubbed his head against the polished leather shoe of the stranger. A deep purr vibrated through the quiet morning. For the first time, the impossible happened. The Mafia boss smiled. It wasn't a broad smile. It lasted less than a second. But every man standing behind him noticed, because none of them had seen it in years. Luca slowly knelt onto one knee. Rain soaked the expensive fabric of his tailored suit. He didn't seem to notice. His fingers gently scratched behind Onyx's ears. "There you are." His voice was almost a whisper. "You scared me." Grace stared. This couldn't possibly be the same man whose mere presence had emptied an entire street. The tenderness in his touch didn't belong to someone rumored to rule half the city's criminal empire. Yet the bodyguards' faces told another story. No one dared breathe. Marco Romano watched quietly from the bottom of the steps. He had worked beside Luca for nearly 20 years. He had witnessed interrogations, executions, negotiations with presidents of multinational corporations, wars between crime families, but he had never seen his boss kneel. Not for anyone, except Onyx. Grace finally found her voice. "He's injured." Luca looked up. Their eyes met for the first time. Something unexpected passed between them. She didn't lower her gaze. Most people did. Most people couldn't endure Luca DeLuca's stare for more than a few seconds. Grace simply looked concerned. Not frightened. Not impressed. Concerned. "He has a fractured front leg," she continued. "I cleaned several cuts. He's dehydrated. I gave him fluids and pain medication." Luca listened without interrupting. When she finished, he lowered his eyes to Onyx again. "You took care of him." It wasn't a question. No animal deserves to suffer. Another silence. Luca reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Several bodyguards shifted slightly. Grace instinctively stiffened. Instead of a weapon, he removed a neatly folded white handkerchief. He gently wiped rainwater from Onyx's ears. "You don't like storms," he murmured. "You never did." Grace watched the scene with quiet disbelief. The cat looked at him with unmistakable affection. Yet, every few seconds, Onyx glanced back toward Grace, as though making sure she hadn't disappeared. Luca noticed his expression remained unreadable, but something inside him shifted. "How much?" Grace blinked. "What?" "The treatment. I'll pay." She shook her head. "I haven't finished treating him yet. I asked the price. I know." She folded her arms. "And I'm telling you that your cat still needs another x-ray in a week." A few bodyguards exchanged nervous glances. Nobody spoke to Luca DeLuca like that. Not bankers. Not judges. Not politicians. Certainly not strangers. Luca regarded her quietly. Then, "How much?" Grace Sullivan, $387. Marco instinctively reached for his wallet. Luca stopped him. He stepped closer, close enough that Grace noticed tiny silver threads woven into his black tie, close enough to smell cedarwood and rain. Without breaking eye contact, he removed a plain black credit card. No logo, no bank name, only a silver wolf engraved in the corner. Grace accepted it, ran the payment, returned the receipt. No autograph, no hesitation, just another customer. When she handed the card back, she said something no one expected. "Try keeping him indoors during storms." Several bodyguards nearly looked horrified. Marco closed his eyes briefly. Luca stared at her. Seconds passed. Then, "I'll remember that." Grace carefully picked up Onyx. "I still need to change his bandage." Luca nodded once. "I'll wait." "You don't have to." "I know." He sat down on the wooden bench outside the clinic, as if he intended to spend the entire morning there. Marco approached quietly. "Boss?" Luca didn't look away from the clinic window. "Cancel my meetings. There are negotiations at noon. They can wait." The Russians? They can wait. Marco nodded immediately. Yes, boss. Across the street, people began filming with their phones. Nobody understood why the city's most feared crime lord was sitting outside a tiny veterinary clinic. Within minutes, the images spread across social media. Why is Luca DeLuca sitting outside an animal clinic? Who is the woman inside? Is she his girlfriend? Has someone kidnapped his cat? Speculation exploded. Grace knew nothing about it. She was too busy replacing Onyx's bandage. You really are handsome. She smiled while wrapping fresh gauze around the tiny leg. But you gave me quite the scare. Onyx purred. Grace laughed softly. I suppose your owner was worried too. Outside, Luca watched through the window. He couldn't hear the conversation. He didn't need to. He recognized that smile. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't admiration. It was genuine kindness. Rare, uncalculated, the kind he hadn't seen directed toward him since he was 12 years old. His mother had smiled like that. So had the elderly nun who once hid him during a gang massacre. Everyone else had eventually wanted something. Money, protection, power, Grace. Wanted nothing. An hour later, Onyx refused to leave. Grace carried him toward Luca. The cat twisted in her arms, reached one paw toward her shoulder, then buried his face against her neck. Luca noticed immediately. So, Grace smiled awkwardly. I think he likes me. The bodyguards almost laughed. Almost. Marco knew what everyone else was thinking. This cat hated strangers. Onyx barely tolerated anyone except Luca. Yet after one night, he clearly didn't want to leave Grace. Luca extended his arms. Come. Onyx looked at him, then looked back at Grace. Then, to everyone's surprise, stayed exactly where he was. Grace laughed. I don't think he's ready. The silence that followed felt strangely intimate. Luca didn't force the cat. He simply watched. Then he asked quietly, Will you come with him? Grace frowned. What? He trusts you. He'll heal faster if you're nearby. She blinked. You want me to? Visit? No. Another pause. I want to hire you. Grace stared. I'm a veterinarian. I know. I own a clinic. I know. I have patients. I know. He took one slow step closer. I also know that if Onyx refuses treatment from anyone else, he glanced at the cat, then I need the only person he'll allow near him. Grace hesitated. The offer felt absurd. So did everything about this morning. She looked at the cat, then at the convoy of black SUVs, then back at Luca. I don't make house calls. A faint smile returned to his face. You've never been invited to my house. Grace raised an eyebrow. And where exactly is your house? Luca answered without pride, without arrogance, simply as fact. DeLuca Manor. The color drained from Grace's face. She had heard that name before. Everyone in Chicago had. The mansion surrounded by 20-foot walls. The estate no one entered without permission. The place whispered about in newspaper investigations, FBI rumors, and late-night crime documentaries. She looked again at the man standing before her. Suddenly, the expensive suit, the armed guards, the convoy, the wolf crest, everything fit together. Her heartbeat quickened. You. Luca finished the sentence for her. Yes, I'm Luca DeLuca. The name landed like thunder. Every story she'd ever heard came rushing back. A man who controlled half the city's underworld. A ghost no witness could ever identify. A king who never appeared in photographs unless he wanted to. And now, he was standing less than 3 feet away, asking her to care for his cat. Grace should have been terrified. Instead, she looked down at Onyx, who was happily asleep against her chest. Then back at Luca. I'll take care of him. She paused, but only because he needs me. For the first time in years, someone had drawn a line between kindness and fear in front of Luca DeLuca. And instead of being offended, he found himself unable to stop thinking about her. As the convoy finally pulled away from the quiet street, neither Grace nor Luca realized that someone had been watching from a rooftop across the intersection, through the lens of a high-powered camera. A gloved finger pressed the shutter. Click. One photograph. Grace, Luca, and Onyx between them. The image was transmitted instantly to another phone across the city. A single message appeared beneath it. We found the cat. The woman is with him. A man reading the message smiled coldly. Victor Moretti leaned back in his chair, swirling a glass of whiskey. So, he murmured, the devil finally has something he can't afford to lose. The rain had stopped, but the city still looked as though it were holding its breath. Grace stood alone in her clinic doorway long after the convoy disappeared around the corner. The street slowly came back to life. A delivery truck rolled past. A cyclist hurried through a puddle. Someone across the street reopened the bakery. Normal. Everything looked normal again, except nothing was. She glanced down at the black business card resting in her hand. No phone number, no email, no address. Only one word embossed in silver. DeLuca. She turned it over. Blunk. No way, she whispered to herself. She tossed it into a drawer beneath the reception desk. I'm not getting involved. By noon, the internet had different plans. Grace's receptionist, Megan, burst through the clinic door holding her phone. Grace. Grace looked up from cleaning surgical instruments. What happened? Megan's eyes were impossibly wide. You're everywhere. Grace frowned. What? You and him. She pushed the phone into Grace's hands. The first headline read, Who is the mystery woman with Luca DeLuca? The second, Chicago's most feared man visits unknown veterinarian. The third was worse. Is the Mafia King in love? Grace nearly dropped the phone. This is insane. They've already guessed your name. Megan scrolled again. There are pictures from every angle. Grace's stomach tightened. One photo showed Luca kneeling beside Onyx. Another showed Grace handing him the payment receipt. One image taken from across the street captured the exact moment their eyes met through the rain. It looked intimate. It wasn't. But the camera told a different story. Grace rubbed her forehead. I don't even know him. Megan lowered her voice. You know who he is, right? Grace nodded slowly. I know enough. No, Megan whispered. You don't. Across the city, inside DeLuca Manor, Luca stood in the conservatory. Morning sunlight filtered through enormous glass windows. Rare orchids lined the marble floor. A fountain whispered quietly in the center of the room. Everything had been restored after the previous night's security breach. Everything. Except Onyx. The black cat refused to leave the travel carrier. Every time one of the household veterinarians approached, hey, he'd sit. When Luca opened the carrier, Onyx climbed onto his lap, but instead of settling down, he stared toward the front gate. Waiting, Luca noticed immediately. You miss her. The cat answered with a quiet meow. Marco entered silently. The security investigation is complete. Luca continued stroking Onyx's fur. Dog. 3 guards accepted money from Moretti. They're gone. Luca nodded once. Gone. Marco understood the meaning behind the single word. There would be no prison. No second chances. Betrayal inside the DeLuca family had only one ending. Marco hesitated. There is another issue. Luca looked up. The photographs. Marco placed a tablet on the table. Every major news outlet had picked up the story. Every gossip blog. Every crime forum. Every social media platform. One headline caught Luca's attention. The only woman who made Luca DeLuca smile. He stared at it for several long seconds, then quietly asked, How many people know where she lives? Marco answered honestly. Banal. Probably everyone. Silence settled over the room. Dangerous silence. Marco knew that expression. Luca wasn't angry. He was calculating. That was worse. Finally, increased surveillance. Marco nodded. At the manor? Luca shook his head. No. Another pause. Here. Grace had just finished treating a golden retriever when the first bouquet arrived. White lilies. Knocard. An hour later. Red roses. Knocard. Then orchids. Then peonies. Then expensive imported tulips she'd only seen in magazines. By late afternoon, the clinic looked more like a luxury flower shop than an animal hospital. Megan laughed nervously. I think someone has a crush. Grace glared. This isn't funny. The delivery driver returned. Another arrangement, this one nearly 3 feet tall. Finally, a small envelope. Grace sighed with relief. At least someone explained this insanity. She opened it. Inside was one handwritten sentence. Thank you for saving my family. El date. No hearts. No flirtation. No perfume. Just 7 words. Grace read them 3 times. Family. He had called the cat family. Something inside her softened. Only a little. That evening, Onyx refused dinner. 3 different veterinarians tried. He ignored them all. Luca watched quietly from across the room. He won't eat. No. He keeps looking toward the gate. Marco folded his arms. We can ask Dr. Collins to come again. Luca shook his head. He doesn't want Collins. He wants her. Silence. Marco finally smiled. I've never seen Onyx choose someone this quickly. Neither had Luca. Animals sense things humans ignored. Fear, lies, cruelty. Onyx trusted Grace after one night. That alone interested Luca more than he wanted to admit. At exactly 8:17 p.m., Grace locked the clinic. She barely made it halfway across the parking lot before noticing him. An elderly homeless man. Thin, shivering. His coat completely soaked. Curled beside a dumpster with a small cardboard box. Inside, 3 abandoned kittens. Grace didn't hesitate. She knelt immediately. Oh no, the kittens were barely breathing. Without thinking, she removed her own jacket and wrapped it around them. The old man looked embarrassed. I tried keeping them warm. I know, they wouldn't leave their mother. Grace looked around. Where is she? The man lowered his head. She didn't make it. Grace closed her eyes briefly, then smiled gently. We'll save these 3. Neither of them noticed the black SUV parked across the street. Inside, 2 DeLuca security agents watched everything. One quietly spoke into an earpiece. Boss, she's doing it again. 20 minutes later, Luca watched the security footage from inside his study. Grace carrying freezing kittens. Grace giving the old man money. Grace buying him hot coffee. Grace smiling as though none of it required recognition. Marco stood behind him. You've watched this 3 times. I know. Why? Luca answered without looking away. Nobody was watching her. Marco frowned. So? She still did it. Another silence. That was rare. Very few acts of kindness survived when no audience existed. Grace expected nothing. No photographs. No applause. No reward. She simply couldn't walk away. Luca leaned back slowly. What do we know about her? Marco opened a file. Grace Sullivan, 31, doctor of veterinary medicine. No criminal record. No outstanding debt except student loans. No political affiliations. No relationships. No children. No social media worth mentioning. No gambling. No substance abuse. No suspicious financial activity. Marco looked up. She's remarkably ordinary. Luca stared at Grace's file. Nobody is ordinary. The next morning, Grace opened the clinic to find a familiar black SUV parked across the street. Not moving, just waiting. She frowned. They're back. Megan peeked through the blinds. I think they're watching. Grace Sahil. They're protecting. From what? Grace didn't answer, because she didn't know. She found out 3 hours later. The clinic bell rang. A young woman entered carrying a Yorkshire Terrier. Perfect makeup, designer handbag, expensive sunglasses. She smiled politely. My dog has been limping. Grace welcomed her inside. Let's take a look. The woman placed the tiny dog on the examination table. Grace bent down to examine the injured paw. At that exact moment, the woman quietly reached into her handbag. Not for a wallet, not for a phone, for a small silver syringe. Outside, one of Luca's surveillance agents saw it through the clinic window. His voice exploded through the radio. Move. The clinic door burst open. 3 suited bodyguards rushed inside. The elegant woman spun around in panic. The syringe slipped from her hand. One guard caught her wrist before the needle reached Grace's neck. Another disarmed her instantly. The Yorkshire Terrier barked wildly. Grace stumbled backward. What is happening? The woman's expression transformed completely. Gone was the polite smile. Only hatred remained. She screamed at Grace. It should have been the cat. The room froze. Grace stared in confusion. What? The woman laughed hysterically. You weren't supposed to find him. One bodyguard forced her to the floor. Another searched her purse. Inside, they found cash, a fake passport, 2 additional syringes, and a photograph. Grace's blood ran cold. It was a picture of her, standing on her porch, holding Onyx the night of the storm. Someone had been watching her before Luca ever arrived. The lead bodyguard looked at the photo, then at Grace. His face hardened. He spoke quietly into his earpiece. Boss, a pause, then only 4 words. They found her first. Across the city. Luca stood abruptly from his desk before Marco even finished relaying the message. His chair crashed backward onto the marble floor. Every person in the room went silent. When? 2 minutes ago. Is she alive? Yes. Luca was already walking. No. He corrected himself coldly. Prepare the convoy. Marco didn't need to ask where they were going. For the first time in years, the king of Chicago's underworld was leaving his fortress in broad daylight. Not for business, not for war, not for revenge. For one woman, because someone had dared to threaten the person his cat had chosen. And deep inside, Luca realized a truth he had spent days refusing to acknowledge. He was no longer protecting Grace only because of Onyx. He was protecting her because the thought of losing her had already become unbearable. Grace had treated gunshot wounds on stray dogs. She had calmed terrified horses after barn fires. She had even stitched together an injured police K-9 while officers exchanged gunfire outside the emergency clinic. But nothing compared to the feeling of standing in her own examination room while 3 armed men pinned a screaming woman to the floor. The syringe rolled beneath the stainless steel table. One of Luca's bodyguards picked it up using a handkerchief. He didn't touch it with his bare hands. Another carefully sealed it inside an evidence bag. Grace stared. What is that? The lead bodyguard answered without emotion. Poison. Her heart stopped. What? It would have stopped your heart in less than 2 minutes. The room became strangely quiet. Grace looked back at the woman lying on the floor. You came here with a dog. The woman smiled. It wasn't my dog. Grace looked toward the frightened Yorkshire Terrier trembling inside its carrier. The little animal had been drugged. Its pupils were dilated. Its breathing shallow. The woman had used it, simply to get close enough. Grace suddenly felt sick. Outside, the convoy arrived. Not 5 SUVs. Not 10. 22 black armored vehicles flooded the street in less than 30 seconds. Traffic stopped instantly. Pedestrians scattered. The bakery owner pulled down his metal security gate without asking questions. Everyone recognized the symbol on the lead SUV. The Silver Wolf. Luca DeLuca had come himself. Inside the clinic, the atmosphere shifted before Grace even saw him. Every bodyguard straightened. Every radio went silent. The front door opened. Luca stepped inside. His charcoal overcoat was still damp from the rain. His expression revealed nothing. Yet everyone in the room instinctively lowered their eyes. Everyone, except Grace. She watched him walk directly toward her. He never looked at the captured woman, never acknowledged his own security team. His attention remained fixed entirely on Grace. Are you hurt? His voice was calm, controlled. Grace blinked. He repeated the question, slower this time. Are it? You. Hurt? She shook her head. No. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached forward. Grace instinctively stiffened. His hand stopped only inches from her face. He noticed a tiny scratch near her jawline, probably from stumbling backward against a cabinet. His fingers hovered there, never touching, as though asking permission without words. Then, very gently, his thumb brushed a loose strand of hair away from the cut. The contact lasted barely a second, but Grace felt it everywhere. Not because it was romantic, because it was impossibly restrained. A man powerful enough to command armies, acting as though he feared frightening her. He lowered his hand immediately. "You're bleeding." Grace unconsciously touched the scratch. "I didn't even notice." "I did." Behind them, the captured assassin laughed. A cold, mocking sound echoed through the clinic. "So, the devil really does have a weakness." Luca didn't turn around. Not immediately. His eyes remained on Grace. Only after several seconds did he finally look toward the woman. The warmth disappeared from his face. The room seemed colder. "What is your name?" The woman smiled. "You already know. I asked because I wanted to hear you say it." She remained silent. Luca nodded once, the smallest gesture imaginable. 2 bodyguards understood immediately. They lifted the woman to her feet. No shouting, no violence, just quiet efficiency. She suddenly looked afraid, very afraid. Luca stepped closer, still speaking softly. "Who sent you?" "Silence. You have one opportunity." She laughed again. "Go to hell." Another pause. Then Luca said something that chilled everyone present. "I've been there, and they sent me back." The woman swallowed. Grace had never heard a sentence delivered with such terrifying calm. Marco entered carrying a tablet. "The poison has been identified." Luca glanced at the report. "Tetrodotoxin. Extremely rare, nearly impossible to obtain." His expression darkened. Only one organization in Chicago had access to it. The Moretti family. Exactly as he suspected. He looked back at the woman. "Te Victor." His voice became almost gentle. "That this mistake will cost him everything." The woman suddenly lunged toward Grace. Not with a weapon. With her words, "He doesn't want the cat." She screamed desperately. "He wants what the cat was carrying." The room froze. Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman laughed through bloodied lips. "You still don't know?" Before anyone could stop her, she bit down hard. A hidden cyanide capsule cracked between her teeth. Marco reacted instantly. "Stop her!" Too late. Foam appeared at the corners of her mouth. Within seconds, she collapsed. Dead. Grace rushed forward on instinct. "No." She checked for a pulse. Nothing. She began CPR anyway. 30 compressions. 2 breaths. Again. 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 Marco quietly lowered her hands. "It's over." Grace looked horrified. "I could've..." "No. There was nothing you could have done." Silence filled the clinic. Luca watched Grace kneeling beside someone who had just tried to murder her. Trying to save the assassin anyway. Even now, she couldn't stop trying to save lives. Something tightened painfully inside his chest. 20 minutes later, FBI vehicles surrounded the block. Chicago police arrived shortly afterward. Detective Elena Brooks stepped beneath the crime scene tape. She stopped the moment she saw Luca standing outside the clinic. Her jaw tightened. "Mr. DeLuca." Luca nodded politely. "Detective, you always seem to appear wherever bodies turn up." He answered without hesitation. "So do you." For the first time, Grace realized the detective wasn't surprised to see him. This wasn't their first meeting. Brooks approached Grace. "I'm Detective Elena Brooks. I need to ask you a few questions." Grace nodded. "Of course." Before the detective could begin, Luca interrupted. "She'll answer tomorrow." Brooks looked irritated. "She is a witness. She's in shock. I'll decide that." "No." His voice remained perfectly calm. "You won't?" An uncomfortable silence stretched between them. Finally, the detective sighed. "I'll return tomorrow morning." She looked directly at Grace. "Don't leave town." Luca almost smiled. Neither of them commented on how impossible that request suddenly sounded. An hour later, the clinic had been cleaned. Evidence removed. The body taken away. The shattered glass replaced with plywood. Grace sat alone on the examination table. The adrenaline had finally faded, leaving only exhaustion. Luca stood near the window. watching security teams inspect the surrounding buildings. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "You knew someone would come." He didn't lie. "I hoped I was wrong. You were watching my clinic." "Yes." "For how long?" "Since this morning." She stood slowly. "You had people following me. I had people protecting you. I never asked for protection." "No, you didn't." Another silence. Grace crossed her arms. "My life was normal 2 days ago." "I know. And now, someone just tried to kill me." "I know." My picture was inside her purse. "I know." She looked directly into his eyes. "What aren't you telling me?" Luca didn't answer, because the truthful answer was worse than any lie. He wasn't yet certain himself. That evening, Grace closed the clinic early. She packed a small overnight bag. She needed space, silence, time to think. Instead, she opened the front door and froze. The entire street had changed. Black SUVs stood at every intersection. Armed security personnel occupied nearby rooftops. Unmarked vehicles patrolled continuously. Neighbors watched nervously through curtains. The neighborhood had become a fortress. Grace turned toward Luca. "You've occupied my street. I secured it. This isn't security. This is martial law. It is temporary." She laughed bitterly. "You don't know the meaning of temporary." "No, I don't." He admitted it without shame. Because men like Luca DeLuca didn't live temporary lives. They built permanent empires, permanent enemies, permanent wars. Grace suddenly understood something. If she remained near him, this danger would never disappear. She looked at Onyx, sleeping peacefully inside his travel carrier, then back at Luca. "I think." She swallowed hard. "You should take him home." Luca nodded once. "I came to do exactly that." He walked toward the carrier, opened the door. Onyx stepped out. Grace smiled sadly. "Go on." The cat looked at Luca. Then, without warning, turned around, walked back to Grace, jumped into her arms, curled against her chest, refusing to move. The room fell silent. Even Marco couldn't hide his surprise. Luca watched the scene quietly, then asked the question that changed everything. "What if—" He paused. "He isn't choosing between us?" Grace looked up. "What? What if?" His dark eyes never left hers. "He's trying to keep us together?" Before Grace could answer, every phone in the room vibrated simultaneously. Marco checked the encrypted alert. His face lost all color. He looked at Luca. "Boss." "What?" The manner. A pause. Then the words no one expected. "It's under attack." Luca's expression became stone. Marco continued. "They're not looking for money. They're searching every room." Another message arrived. Marco stared at it in disbelief. "They're looking for—" He slowly raised his eyes toward Onyx. Something hidden inside the cat. The room fell completely silent. Grace instinctively tightened her hold on Onyx. The little black cat looked up at her with trusting, golden eyes, completely unaware that he had just become the center of a war capable of setting all of Chicago on fire. And for the first time, Grace realized that rescuing one frightened animal during a storm hadn't simply changed her life. It had placed her at the heart of a secret, powerful enough to make the city's most ruthless mafia families kill without hesitation. Grace couldn't breathe. The words echoed inside the clinic long after Marco lowered the encrypted phone. "They're looking for something hidden inside the cat." She instinctively tightened her arms around Onyx. The little black cat purred, completely unaware that dozens of armed men across Chicago were now hunting him, not because of who he belonged to, but because of what he might be carrying. Grace looked from Marco to Luca. "What does that mean?" Neither man answered immediately. Luca's silence was different this time. It wasn't calculated. It was conflicted. For the first time since they had met, Grace saw uncertainty flicker behind his dark eyes. That frightened her more than the guns. Because men like Luca DeLuca weren't supposed to be uncertain. DeLuca Manor. 40 minutes earlier, the mansion had looked peaceful. Morning sunlight reflected off marble fountains. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Housekeepers prepared dinner. Security cameras swept the grounds every 5 seconds. Then, everything went black. 1 second. Exactly 1 second. The estate lost power. Backup generators activated immediately. Too late. 6 masked men had already crossed the northern wall. Not through the gates. Through the underground drainage tunnel built almost 80 years earlier. Someone had given them the blueprints. Someone on the inside. By the time emergency power returned, the intruders were already inside the private West Wing. They ignored jewelry, ignored cash, ignored priceless paintings, ignored Luca's private vault. Instead, they tore apart one specific room, the conservatory. Every cat toy, every scratching post, every food bowl, every cushion, every inch of the room where Onyx usually slept. One attacker shouted, "It isn't here!" Another smashed open the marble fireplace. Still nothing. Then the team leader growled into his radio. "The cat escaped before we got here." A cold voice answered through static. "Then find the woman." Back at the clinic, Grace looked down at Onyx. "You knew?" She wasn't sure who she was asking. Luca, Marco, or the cat himself. Marco finally broke the silence. "Boss, we don't have much time." Luca nodded once, then looked directly at Grace. "There are things I should have told you yesterday." "You think?" Her voice carried more hurt than anger. "You've had armed men outside my clinic. My phone won't stop ringing. Someone tried to poison me. And now you're telling me your cat is somehow part of a mafia war?" She laughed softly, the kind of laugh people make right before they cry. "My life disappeared overnight." Luca accepted every word without defending himself. "You're right." She blinked. "I am?" "Yes." Another silence. Then he quietly said, "I'm sorry." Marco looked up. So did every bodyguard. No one had heard those words leave Luca DeLuca's mouth in years. Grace wasn't prepared for them either. They sounded genuine. That made them dangerous. Luca slowly approached. He stopped several feet away. Never closer than Grace seemed comfortable allowing. "When my mother died," he began quietly, "she left me one thing." Grace waited. Not money, not property, not power. He glanced toward Onyx. "Him." Grace frowned. "The cat?" "No." "The bloodline." She looked confused. Luca continued, "Onyx is the last descendant of a rare line of cats my mother raised." Grace almost smiled. Surely that couldn't be what this was about. Then Luca added, "They were never ordinary cats." Her smile disappeared. "What do you mean?" Marco answered instead. "Your medical scanner didn't find a microchip because it wasn't looking for the right frequency." Grace stared. "Excuse me?" Luca nodded. "There is a chip, but not a veterinary one." The room suddenly felt colder. Grace instinctively touched Onyx's collar. Someone implanted something inside him? When he was a kitten. Why? Luca looked toward the rain-covered window. To protect something. Grace's veterinarian instincts immediately took over. "That's impossible." Marco raised an eyebrow. "It isn't. It would require surgery." It did. The risk of infection was worth it. Grace looked horrified. "You put a tracking device inside him?" Luca shook his head. "No." "Then what?" Another long silence. Finally, "Okay." Grace frowned. "What kind of key?" "A digital one." Marco opened his encrypted tablet. A 3-dimensional image appeared. It wasn't shaped like a traditional key. It looked like an advanced biometric storage capsule, smaller than a grain of rice. Grace whispered, "That's military technology." Marco nodded. "Experimental." She looked back at Luca. "What does it unlock?" Luca answered honestly, "I don't know." Grace blinked. "You don't know?" "No." "You risked everything for something you don't even understand?" "My mother made me promise." "Promise what?" His eyes darkened. "That no one could ever possess both." "Both what?" "The key and the box it opens?" Silence settled once more. Grace had expected criminals. Power. Money. Not promises made to dying mothers. Nothing about Luca fit the monster she had imagined. Everything seemed more complicated. Suddenly, Onyx jumped from Grace's arms. Everyone reacted instantly. The cat ignored them all. He limped toward one corner of the clinic, stopped beside an old bookshelf, then meowed loudly. Once, twice, 3 times. Grace frowned. What's wrong? Onyx pawed at the floor. Again, again, again. Marco narrowed his eyes. Boss. Luca watched quietly. The cat wasn't behaving randomly. He was trying to tell them something. Grace knelt beside him. What is it? Onyx scratched the wooden floorboard. Grace tapped the surface. Hollow. She looked up. This isn't concrete. Marco immediately motioned to 2 guards. Within seconds, the floorboard was lifted. Everyone stared. Hidden beneath it was a small waterproof envelope. Grace gasped. I've never seen that before. The envelope was old, very old. Its edges had yellowed with time. Someone had hidden it decades earlier. Marco carefully handed it to Luca. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he turned toward Grace. May I? She nodded slowly. Inside, there was only one item, a faded black and white photograph. Grace's heart skipped. The picture showed an old veterinary clinic. Standing in front of it was a smiling young woman holding a black kitten. Beside her stood a man wearing a military uniform. Behind them, a wooden sign, Sullivan Animal Hospital. Grace's breathing stopped. No, she whispered. That's impossible. She looked closer. The young woman, the same eyes, the same smile. My grandmother. She looked at Luca. How does my grandmother know your family? Luca wasn't looking at the photograph. He was staring at the tiny kitten in the woman's arms. His voice became almost inaudible. That's Onyx's mother. The room fell silent. Grace slowly lowered herself into a chair. This clinic, she looked around as though seeing it for the first time, has been here for over 60 years. Marco nodded. So has the photograph. Grace shook her head. I've repaired this floor twice. I never found it. Luca quietly answered. Because no one was supposed to. Another bodyguard hurried into the room. Boss. What? We intercepted communications. Marco looked up. Report. The Moretti family has mobilized. How many? Nearly 100 men. Grace's face drained of color. For a cat? The bodyguard answered. No. He looked directly at her. For you, outside, the quiet neighborhood no longer resembled a neighborhood. Black SUVs blocked every intersection. Police helicopters circled overhead. Unmarked vans parked on rooftops. Neighbors were being evacuated one house at a time. Grace stepped toward the window. This is insane. Luca joined her. No. His voice remained calm. This, he watched armed security teams take positions along nearby rooftops, is the beginning. Grace looked at him. What happens now? He turned toward her. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then, with a quiet certainty that sent a chill through everyone in the room, he answered. You can no longer stay here. Grace's heart sank. This clinic is my home. I know my patients. I know my entire life. I know. She looked away, struggling to hold back tears. I don't want your world. Luca's expression softened for only an instant. I've spent my entire life trying to keep my world away from people like you. He paused, his gaze lingering on Onyx curled against Grace's feet. But my enemies made that choice for us. A deafening explosion shattered the moment. Ends, boom. The clinic's front windows exploded inward in a shower of glass. The lights went out. Smoke filled the reception area. Outside, automatic gunfire erupted across the street. Someone shouted through the chaos, "Sniper!" Grace instinctively dropped to the floor, covering Onyx with her body. Before she could react again, strong arms wrapped around her. Luca pulled her against his chest, turning his own body toward the shattered windows. Glass rained across his back. Bullets slammed into the brick wall behind them. His security team returned fire as black SUVs screeched across the intersection. Grace looked up in shock. He wasn't protecting himself. He was shielding her. For the first time, the devil of Chicago had willingly placed himself between death and the woman who had once stopped in the rain to save a frightened black cat. The first bullet shattered the clinic's front window. The second tore through the reception desk. The third never reached Grace. It struck Luca squarely in the shoulder. The impact spun him half a step sideways, but he never let go of her. Instead, he pulled Grace lower against the floor, wrapping one arm around her and using his own body as a shield. The sound inside the clinic became unbearable. Gunfire, shattering glass, exploding tires, the screams of neighbors fleeing the street, and somewhere beneath it all, Onyx cried, not loudly, just once. A frightened, broken sound. Grace looked up. Luca, I'm fine. He wasn't. Dark blood was already spreading across the sleeve of his black coat, yet his eyes never left the shattered entrance. Every instinct he possessed remained focused on one thing, keeping her alive. Outside, Marco's voice thundered through the encrypted radio. Roof! Northeast building! 2 DeLuca snipers answered immediately. 3 suppressed shots cracked through the rain. Silence. Then another burst of automatic fire erupted from the alley. The Moretti family hadn't sent assassins. They had sent soldiers. Nearly 30 armed men were advancing from 3 different directions. This wasn't an assassination. It was an extraction. They wanted Grace alive. Grace tore a strip from her own sweater and pressed it against Luca's shoulder. Hold still. I don't have time. You'll make it worse. I've been shot before. She looked directly into his eyes. And I've treated patients who thought exactly the same thing. For a brief second, he almost smiled. Even while bullets were chewing through the brick wall behind them, she was still arguing with him like he was any other stubborn patient. You really don't know how to be afraid of me. Grace tightened the makeshift bandage. I was. He raised an eyebrow. Was? I still don't know if I should trust you. Her voice trembled slightly. But I know one thing. She met his gaze without looking away. You've had 10 chances to save yourself. You chose me every time. Those words hit Luca harder than the bullet, because they were true. And because he hadn't realized it until she said it, another explosion rocked the building. The ceiling lights flickered. Plaster rained down around them. Marco rushed into the treatment room. Boss. Luca stood immediately despite the blood soaking through his coat. Status. They're closing in. The police? 10 minutes away. Luca gave a quiet laugh. We don't have 10 minutes. Marco nodded. No. He looked toward Grace. The safe tunnel. Grace frowned. Tunnel. Luca hesitated. He had sworn never to reveal it to anyone outside the family. Then another burst of gunfire echoed outside. The decision made itself. Come with me. Marco pulled a heavy steel cabinet away from the back wall. Behind it, an old iron door emerged. Grace stared. I've worked here for 7 years. I never knew that existed. Luca glanced at her. It wasn't built for you. He opened the door. Stone steps disappeared into darkness beneath the clinic. Cold air drifted upward. Onyx jumped into Grace's arms before anyone asked him to. Marco handed Luca a pistol. Luca didn't take it. Instead, he handed it back. You keep it. Marco frowned. Boss, if I need a gun? Luca looked toward the burning reception area. I've already failed. The tunnel stretched beneath the old neighborhood like the veins of another city. Brick walls, iron pipes, forgotten railway tracks. Everything smelled of damp stone and history. Grace walked beside Luca in silence. She noticed him hiding the pain in his shoulder. His breathing had become slightly uneven. His left hand occasionally pressed against the wound when he thought no one was watching. She noticed. Of course she did. After nearly 20 minutes, they emerged inside an abandoned church overlooking Lake Michigan. The stained glass windows had long since shattered. Rain drifted through the empty sanctuary. Dust covered the wooden pews. A giant stone cross still stood above the altar. Grace looked around in disbelief. This place, my mother brought me here. Luca's voice echoed softly through the empty church. When I was a boy, it's abandoned. It wasn't then. He walked slowly toward the altar. His hand brushed across the worn wood. When the war started, he smiled sadly. She said churches were the only places where even monsters remembered how to whisper. Grace looked at him. For the first time, she saw something she had never expected. Not power, not fear, grief, the kind carried for decades. Onyx suddenly jumped from Grace's arms. He ran straight toward the altar, then stopped. His paws scratched against the cracked stone floor. Once, twice, 3 times. Grace exchanged a glance with Luca. The floor again. Marco and 2 guards pushed the heavy altar aside. Beneath it, another hidden compartment. This time, a small black metal box, no larger than a jewelry case. Its surface bore the same silver wolf crest as Onyx's collar. Luca slowly picked it up. His hands trembled almost imperceptibly. For the first time in 28 years, he was holding the object his mother had died protecting. Grace watched quietly. "Aren't you going to open it?" He shook his head. "I can't." "Why not?" "There isn't a lock." Grace frowned. "What do you mean?" Marco pointed toward Onyx. "The key." Understanding finally struck. The implant inside Onyx wasn't valuable by itself. It completed the mechanism. Without the cat, the box would never open. Without the box, the implant meant nothing. His mother had separated them intentionally. Neither piece could betray the other. Luca carefully placed the box on the stone altar. Onyx approached it. The tiny cat sniffed the metal surface. A faint click echoed through the church. Everyone held their breath. The lid slowly unlocked. Inside, there wasn't gold. No diamonds. No bank accounts. Only a single leather journal. And a sealed envelope. Grace blinked. "That's it?" Luca opened the journal first. The handwriting was elegant. Italian. His mother's. He read silently, then stopped. His breathing caught. Grace saw tears gathering in the eyes of the man everyone believed incapable of crying. "What is it?" He handed her the final page. At the bottom, written in careful English, were the words, "If you are reading this, Luca, it means love survived longer than revenge." Below the sentence rested one final message. Never build an empire so large that you forget how to protect the innocent. The day someone chooses kindness over fear, choose them. Luca closed his eyes. His mother had known, even decades ago. She had known the kind of man he might become, and the kind of woman capable of bringing him back. Grace quietly reached for his hand. Not out of romance. Not yet. Out of compassion. He looked down at her fingers resting against his, then gently intertwined them with his own. This time, he didn't stop himself. Marco opened the sealed envelope. His expression changed instantly. "Boss." Luca looked up. "What?" "It's evidence." Inside were decades of financial records. Secret ledgers. Names. Politicians. Judges. International traffickers. Not DeLuca operations. Moretti operations. Enough evidence to destroy the entire Moretti empire forever. His mother hadn't protected wealth. She had protected justice. Outside, police sirens echoed through the storm. The Moretti gunmen had finally reached the abandoned church. Black SUVs surrounded the building. Armed men took positions behind ancient gravestones. Victor Moretti himself stepped from the lead vehicle. He smiled as he looked toward the ruined sanctuary. "So," he murmured, "the cat found the box." Inside, Luca calmly closed the journal. Then he looked at Grace. "The war ends tonight." She searched his face. "You'll kill him." He was silent for several moments. Then he remembered the final line his mother had written. "Choose kindness over fear." He slowly shook his head. "No." Grace looked surprised. "What will you do?" He smiled, a real smile this time. The one thing he'll never expect. 1 hour later, Chicago watched live television in disbelief. Police stormed the church, not to arrest Luca DeLuca, but to arrest Victor Moretti. The evidence inside the journal implicated politicians, judges, federal contractors, and every surviving Moretti lieutenant. There was nowhere left to run, no one left to bribe. For the first time in decades, the Moretti empire collapsed without Luca firing a single shot. 3 months later. Spring arrived quietly. Grace reopened her clinic. The bullet holes had been repaired. Fresh flowers bloomed outside. Children once again brought injured birds and abandoned puppies through the front door. Life felt normal. Almost. A familiar black SUV stopped across the street. Grace smiled before the engine even switched off. Luca stepped out carrying Onyx. The cat immediately leaped into Grace's arms. "I believe," Luca said, "he still prefers you." Grace laughed. "I think he's keeping an eye on us." "So do I." Silence settled between them. Comfortable. No fear. No secrets. Luca looked around the little clinic that had changed his life. "I spent years believing power could protect what mattered." He looked at Grace. "I was wrong." She tilted her head. "What protects it?" He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. Someone willing to stop in the middle of a storm for a frightened little cat. Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "And someone willing to stand in front of a bullet for a veterinarian." He chuckled softly. "Fair enough." Outside, the rain began again. Gentle this time, Onyx curled between them on the clinic bench, purring contentedly. For the first time in his life, Luca DeLuca no longer felt like the devil of Chicago. Only a man who had finally kept the promise his mother asked of him. Not by conquering the city, but by protecting the kindness that still existed within it. And as Grace leaned her head against his shoulder, neither of them noticed the small brass plaque newly mounted beside the clinic door. It read, "Onyx Animal Rescue Foundation," a quiet reminder that the greatest love stories don't always begin with a grand declaration. Sometimes, they begin with a frightened black cat in the rain,